Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, March 4th, 2021, and around 2 months ago, Jon Ossoff was elected to the United States Senate over Republican incumbent David Perdue. This Senate race was one of the most heavily funded Senate races in United States history. In fact, Jon Ossoff has broken the record as being the highest fundraising Democrat, besides, I believe, Jamie Harrison might have even surpassed him. But overall, this Senate race in particular was one of the most expensive in United States history. $100 million spent on Jon Ossoff and David Perdue. And looking at the results, it was a very close election. Looking at the difference between the two candidates, it was not a very large one. Jon Ossoff defeated David Perdue by just over a percentage point, 1.2% to be exact. But getting to this point was not easy. Getting to this point required there to be a third-party candidate that ultimately landed the Democrats in a runoff election. And I rarely ever like to use the word spoiled when I'm talking about an election because I do believe that every American is entitled to their vote, and I don't want to shame them for doing something that they would have otherwise done, without this even being in consideration. But looking at Shane Hazel, a Libertarian Party candidate, someone who I actually, looking into him, he's not a very prominent political figure. In fact, I'm sure he just put his name on the ballot to make a political statement, to have some type of presence in the American electorate. He runs a podcast. He doesn't hold elected office. He's not someone who represents the Libertarian Party on a national level, as you would see with Gerin Jera or even Joe Jorgensen. And looking at the Senate election, I really did not think that he would expect to have such a large electoral implication. But the fact that he did not end up endorsing really anyone at the end of it, well, I don't really expect him to think that, he would have changed his decision knowing the overall outcome. Looking at the amount of votes that he was able to draw away from David Perdue, which is what I'm going to explain to you in just a moment, ultimately put David Perdue at a point where he was not able to win the election outright in November. And I know this really boiled his blood, because this was a Senate race that was 100% winnable by David Perdue. What did Jon Ossoff have under his belt? Besides being a very great orator and someone who had fundraised millions of dollars for the Democrats in the 2017 special election in Georgia, he did not have any political experience. Now, neither did David Perdue when he was elected in 2014, but the state wasn't looking necessarily for someone with political experience. If you look at the candidates across the country in 2014, it was people who were outsiders taking on the government. And, that partially was what the message was in 2020. But Donald Trump versus Joe Biden wasn't a question of establishment versus outsider, as both of these people had been in the White House or one way or another. And David Perdue, as an incumbent senator, should have had the advantage, and he did. He defeated Jon Ossoff. Had this been any other state, David Perdue would have won his election. But because of the racist policies that have been implemented in this state, and I mean that sincerely, the runoff election system was made to prevent black candidates from making it to Congress and making it to the Senate and making it to the state legislature. It's here for a reason, because, to put it frankly, when we were talking about, before the Civil Rights era or even after, we would see a system in place where it would be a plurality system in the South. And because there would only be many times just one black candidate, the entire black electorate would vote for that one candidate. But that would only bring them to 33, 34, 35% of the vote. But because the white electorate and, the electorate amongst other demographic groups could not discern, you could not choose one candidate, they split the vote. And then the plurality won. So this system was put in place to actually pit one white candidate against a black candidate intentionally, knowing that the eventual outcome would be that the white candidate won. Now, obviously, times have evolved in the South. It's not nowhere near as bad as it used to be, at least for minority Americans, in terms of policies implemented. Many things have been repealed, but that's sort of the history behind this runoff system. If you're wondering why it's in place, this is why. And this is also why the Democrats have been able to use a system that was meant to disadvantage them to now put them up in the majority. But looking at what actually prevented David Perdue from defeating Jon Ossoff in November was Shane Hazel. Jon Ossoff only received 47.9% of the vote. We knew that this would be an uphill climb for Senator Ossoff because he was going against David Perdue, someone who was not expected to lose at all. Looking at his result here, David Perdue was just 0.3 off. All he needed to get is 0.3 out of the 2.3% that Shane Hazel got, and he would have won. 14,857 votes would have put David Perdue at 50%. Get one vote above that, and you win. 14,857 when the Libertarian Party candidate won 115,039. And I don't think I need to explain, that Libertarian Party candidates typically lean to the right. When you look at the vote splitting in 2016, what you saw was that possibly Democrats were winning votes. Not Democrats. Jill Stein was winning many Democratic votes, and Gary Johnson was winning many Republican votes. Libertarians are able to reach across the aisle, grab Democratic votes, Republican votes, but looking at the voters that voted Libertarian, a lot of them did it because they were upset with the way that the government was being handled, especially amidst COVID-19. When you're talking about the voters that voted for Shane Hazel, many of them knew that he wasn't going to win, but they wanted to make a statement that they weren't going to vote for the Republicans or the Democrats. But many of those voters were still right-wing. The majority of the Libertarian Party is right-wing. You cannot deny that. A lot of the default thereafter Libertarian, if they're not on the ballot, is to vote for the GOP, or just not vote entirely, but typically they lean to the right. That's the point I'm getting at here. 14,858 votes would have put David Perdue in the victory slot in November. But the Libertarian Party candidate won 115,000. And because of this one candidate, we entered into a runoff. Now, looking at what was expected from this runoff was nothing super eventful. Looking at the Georgia runoff, Georgia regular race, David Perdue was expected to win, according to FiveThirtyEight. Jon Ossoff only had a 43% chance of victory. But when you take a closer look, and you take a look at the overall chances here, the only way that Ossoff was able to win were through runoffs, where he was able to go through. There were very few points where he was actually crossing over that line, but we rarely ever saw that come down to being the likeliest scenarios out of them all. And looking at the overall Senate forecast, well, it actually got a lot closer. You see, David Perdue was expected to win with a simple majority in November from the very beginning. Throughout the entirety of the final months of the campaign season, David Perdue was not at a point where he was going to lose. Until Biden started heavily investing in Georgia, which we all know now paid off, we saw David Perdue go from being at a high point of 76% chance of victory down to 57% on Election Day. And while he was expected to win, I would take a 43% chance of winning a Senate election. And I'm sure you would too. That doesn't mean it's impossible. While it may be more likely that David Perdue was going to win in November, you also have to realize, Jon Ossoff had a 43% chance of victory. So the forecast wasn't too far off. And looking at the popular vote margin, what do you notice? That the Libertarian Party vote doesn't really change, but the amount of vote for David Perdue does. And looking at that 49.3% to 49% with 1.7%, all that Perdue would have needed was 0.7 out of the expected forecast. It ended up only being 0.3. And looking at this one candidate, this Libertarian Party candidate led the Democrats to victory. Because if you take out the jungle primary system, Perdue would have won. You take out the Libertarian Party candidate, Perdue would have won. Even if you split the vote 60-40, Perdue would have won. All he needed is actually, let me take out my calculator here and do the quick math here. All he would have needed is 13% of the Libertarian Party vote, which we know would have been completely doable for a Republican on the ballot. 13% of 2.3%, David Perdue would have won. So looking at that, you do have to realize, the reason why Ossoff won was partially because this Libertarian Party candidate pushed it into a runoff. And looking at the 2014 Senate election in Georgia, specifically in this Georgia Senate race, they didn't have to worry about this. There was nothing to worry about for the Republicans in 2014. When David Perdue won, I don't know why his name is combining when I say it. When David Perdue won in 2014, it's the same Senate map that was up in 2020 with the exception of an additional Senate race in Arizona and Georgia. What we saw was that there was, another candidate there with 1.9%. But did that have an impact on the race? The answer is no. Michelle Nunn, while I would say someone who was a strong candidate then, just couldn't match the time. 2014 was an exceptional year for the GOP. The Democrats only won 188 House seats, only 46 Senate seats. And I know that seems like, 46 isn't too bad, but the Republicans gained 8 in this Senate election. They went from being at 54 to 46 to 46 to 54. But David Perdue winning here, it wasn't a pickup, but it was a pretty strong victory. 53 to 45. That is a 7.9% victory in this Senate race, which means he was entering into 2020 with an advantage. And looking at the 2016 election results in Georgia, he also had this to his advantage. While Donald Trump won by less than Romney, he was still able to win the state. He won it by 5.1%. Looking at the shift from 2012, well, sure, some parts of the state went to the right and other parts went to the left. Overall, the Atlanta metro area really drove the state to the left. But what we were seeing is that Donald Trump did not have a super stellar performance in Georgia, but it was still a victory. We're talking about, David Perdue going from a point where Trump was winning in 2016 by 5 points to ending up losing by 1 point, a 6-point swing relative to 2016. And also, you do have to point out that the overall Senate election results from the runoff race, that Jon Ossoff outperformed Joe Biden by over a percentage point. And David Perdue got exactly what Donald Trump got. Isn't that very fitting for the situation? David Perdue got exactly what Donald Trump did in the runoff election. And looking at the results, well, this would have been the final blow for the Democrats had David Perdue won it back in November. I don't think I need to remind you the abysmal defeat for the Democrats across the Senate map. On your screen is the 2020 Senate map. I'm sure you haven't seen it since we were talking about the runoff elections back then. But the Senate election results, this is the toss-up map. And what is defined as a toss-up? I essentially characterized every state that was decided by less than 15 points as a toss-up race. I'll worry about the margins in just a moment, but essentially all the safe states are 15 plus, and I've characterized those as already. I think I forgot Alaska. I don't think that one was 15 plus. Let's go ahead and check really quickly. Alaska? No, it was not. So looking at this Senate map, the Democrats had ample opportunities for pickups. They ended up winning Minnesota. Not by a lot, but they still ended up winning it. They ended up winning New Mexico, Colorado. They ended up winning those races. Virginia was completely in reach for the Democrats. But Republicans pushed back. While they were expected to not do so well, or at least not do as well as they did in Kansas, in Iowa, they were still able to win the states. They were still able to win Kansas and win Iowa. The margins were closer than they have been in years past, but it was still a victory for the GOP. Still a 6-year term that these Republicans were elected to. Looking at Mississippi, it was a 10-point victory, but still, Mississippi was actually closer than South Carolina, which I find very interesting, given that South Carolina was the most expensive Senate race in the entire 2020 election cycle. But then the Democrats were also able to win in Michigan. They were able to win in Arizona. But looking at that put them at 48. The GOP also pushed back. They were able to win Alaska. They were able to win Montana, win Texas, and win South Carolina. And as the night went on, they were the projected winners in Maine, projected winners in North Carolina. Sure, some of these races were closer than they had been, but again, 6-year term, these are up in 2026. But it came down to Georgia. And had Shane Hazel not been on the ballot, I have no doubt in my mind David Perdue would have won the Senate race and put the Republicans in the majority. The reason why the Democrats have it now is because of the 50-50 tie. Without Shane Hazel, it would have been won by a lean margin. I have immense respect for Jon Ossoff, for his persistence, for someone who has been a very strong candidate in Georgia specifically, turning tides in the Atlanta metro area one way or another. But he didn't end up winning before. And while I think he was, in hindsight, one of the strongest candidates to run in this race, maybe besides Stacey Abrams, the Senate race was 100% winnable for the GOP. But they couldn't do it because of this Libertarian, and then they went full Trump mode. And we all know how that ended up in Georgia. But looking at that one race, we wouldn't even be in discussion about Biden working with the GOP. Obviously we would, but we wouldn't be talking about, does Biden need to work with the GOP? The Democrats wouldn't have enough votes, even if they won that one runoff race against Kelly Loeffler, to make a decision in the Senate. 49 means nothing when your opposition party is in the majority. 49 means absolutely nothing. 49 could be just as bad as 45 or 40, realistically speaking. Maybe not 40 because filibuster, but 41. Looking at these two races, it just had to be a perfect storm for the Democrats, and they got it. Because by the time we had reached the general election, the polls had indicated the tides had changed. Beginning, Loeffler and Perdue were expected to win immediately after the election. As Donald Trump consistently started saying the election is rigged, Georgia was rigged, attacking Brad Raffensperger, attacking Brian Kemp, Republicans that were just elected by the same electorate 2 years prior, the same electorate that shot out Donald Trump in 2020. And these Republicans jumped on it. Perdue and Loeffler campaigned with Trump. They campaigned together. They wanted to drive up turnout in the rural areas the same way that Donald Trump did. Well, unfortunately for them, that wasn't a winning strategy. The shift from November showed almost every single county shifting to the left. Almost every single county. Maybe because they weren't Trump-like enough. I think more so that many voters changed their minds. Because when you saw that David Perdue, someone who was labeled initially as a more moderate Republican, even though he is someone who had a very weird history with that, I would say not a moderate by my standard, but moderate by others, looking at his history, people were looking at him and saying, he's a moderate Republican. He's someone who represents the views of those traditional Republicans in Georgia, the ones who were able to win, not Donald Trump. But then when he completely backed Donald Trump out of worry of not being endorsed or worry of not having Donald Trump on the race, maybe he would have done it differently, knowing the overall results. He probably would have. Why would you not, right? But looking at what happened there, It completely changed the way that voters perceived David Perdue and ultimately helped Jon Ossoff, someone who had no electoral history, the same way David Perdue did in 2014, but in a different time period. Looking at these results, I'm honestly surprised at the very large margin that Jon Ossoff won by. And I know it seems weird. 1.2%, that's not a lot. But it is. It is a lot for Georgia, for a Democrat. And this would have not been possible without Shane Hazel. And that's the thing. I mean, this is just a very weird scenario that there had to be a Libertarian Party candidate on the ballot in order for the Democrats to win. And I think this also goes to show that the Democratic Party does better sometimes when Libertarians are on the ballot. Looking at the Florida election results in 2018, looking at the sheer margin, the very close race there, I am surprised that we didn't see any major members of the opposition parties, Libertarian, Green, or Independent candidates running in the Florida Senate race in 2018, because that margin was decided by 0.2%. And the reason why this was just a very close race was because we had an incumbent Democrat running against a popular incumbent Republican. And had there been a third-party candidate that could take away, half a percentage point, that would have changed the race. I don't know for who, depending on which party was up, but it would have changed the race and would have made the margin look larger or less. But looking at Shane Hazel, this was just a very perfect storm for the Democrats and ultimately ended up putting them in the majority. Because if you look at the numbers prior to the runoff, Perdue was expected to win. The final results here show that Perdue won by 1.8, but because of the runoff, they advance. The RCB average did not show that Perdue was going to win, but for almost the entirety of the campaign season, it did. And the only reason why it jumped up is because there was a Democratic-rated pollster, and then also, we saw that there was just a Perdue plus 2, Ossoff plus 1, and then Ossoff plus 3 was just too much to counteract. But if you're looking at it, Perdue was widely the expected winner for a very large period of time, according to Real Clear Politics. But then you look at these polls that are taken. The voters that vote for Shane Hazel, 0.9% are from the GOP. 0.5% are from the Democrats. 19% are others, so that could be Libertarians. And then 8.9% are independents. Now, the thing here is that, considering that there are more male voters that say they're voting for Shane Hazel than female voters, I think that's indicator number one, that we are seeing the possibility of the presence of the Republican Party possibly getting more of those votes had Shane Hazel not been on the ballot. But then you could counteract my point in saying, black voters back Shane Hazel by a larger amount than white voters, but also white voters make up a larger composition in this state. So you overall have to come down to, I think gender is a better sign as to whether or not these are more conservative or liberal voters, at least based off history. And looking at the amount of vote that was taken away amongst the independent category, they weren't taking much away from the GOP or the Democrats, but rather undecided voters that at the end of the day did not receive an endorsement from the candidate, that these did not see an endorsement from the candidate that they had initially backed. So they went into 2021 possibly with an open mind, which ultimately helped Jon Ossoff. And this one race could have made all the difference. This one race could have kept the GOP in the majority. 51 to 49 could have been that one thing that was mentioned every single time that people said, why isn't Biden doing enough? Why isn't Biden passing these stimulus checks? Now, technically, they have no excuse. They may be throttled by senators from states, but overall, they have the majority. It doesn't fit the narrative that the Democrats would need to ride into 2022 with as much energy, but they have the majority. I think they'd rather have the majority than they would have to have the chance at winning the majority in 2022. But this one Senate race could have made a monumental difference on the way we saw the Senate unfold, on the way that we would see major pieces of legislation pass. We have already had a 50-50 tie with Kamala Harris breaking the tie. We will have many more over the next 2 years. We will have many more. The question of DC statehood would have been immediately shot down in this Senate. $2,000 checks, $1,400 checks even, immediately shot down. This $1.9 trillion stimulus check, oh my gosh, can you imagine that, right? A $1.9 trillion stimulus package would have been immediately shot down. The Republicans would have forced Biden to change everything about his administration currently. Equality Act, immediately shot down. And while that may very well happen amongst the Democratic Party, and that is a harsh reality for those that realize that a majority of 50-50 is truly the narrowest it could ever be. Not only in numbers, But honestly, it takes a lot of party unity to get things done, and a lot of crossover support, which so far, neither of which are happening on a wide scale. But looking at all of these things that are now in discussion, they would not have been had Shane Hazel not decided to run. Maybe another Libertarian Party candidate could have taken their place, but had a Libertarian Party candidate or a Green Party candidate been on the ballot, we probably would not have seen a runoff election, which is exactly, that's exactly why we saw a runoff election. So overall, I'm not trying to shame anyone or blame a certain candidate for whatever or try to even applaud them for really anything. I think that just Shane Hazel's impact was more monumental than he could have ever envisioned. And the fact that he wouldn't even consider endorsing a candidate after means that maybe he did envision it and that he wouldn't have changed anything had he known. So overall, this is how it would end up, 51-49, a very interesting Senate. It would certainly make a very interesting timeline leading into 2022. But obviously, this is not what happened. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my post-2020 election analysis videos like this one. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.